Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it a few minutes, let some people join. Everyone's having a good evening. See some names of people I recognize. It's always good to see. Hello. You know who you are. Just going to give it another 30 seconds or so. So as I go along, feel free to put questions in the Q&A box. It's just easier for me to keep track of that way, but feel free to put them in as we go along. And you should definitely have some time at the end for answer any questions that you have about what I talked about today, or also things that I didn't get a chance to talk about today. Happy to discuss anything you're interested in. So my talk today specifically is about self-advocacy for teens and young adults with selective mutism. I'm sure many of you here are not teens or young adults with selective mutism, but maybe parents, caregivers, teachers, other doctors, etc. I'm hoping that you'll still be able to take a lot out of this, and maybe how you can frame those discussions with your teen or young adult who has selective mutism, about what this means for them, and then hopefully also give you some perspective on what they may be feeling like in their experiences as well. Before I get started, just want to say that this webinar was made possible thanks to a generous grant from the Gordon Marilyn Macklin Foundation. And I just want to go through a few disclaimers about myself. And most importantly is most of what I'm going to talk about today is based on my own experiences with selective mutism, social anxiety, anxiety in general, and SM treatment over the past 20 or so years. I am not a doctor or treating professional. I cannot give treatment advice. Everything I'm talking about today is really based on my own personal experiences. And I think this is also pretty key, is that just because something really worked for me doesn't mean it will work for everybody. I've spoken to so many people over the past 10 years who have gone through this journey themselves and overcome stuff and used different strategies, and used a strategy that I did and didn't necessarily work for them, and vice versa, something that they did that didn't work for me. It really is not a cookie cutter approach. Yeah, and as I said, just because something didn't work for me doesn't mean it can't work for others who are going through this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my story in the beginning, what selective mutism really means to me and how I think about it, because that kind of shapes how I think have lived with it and how I have approached my anxiety just in general. Selective mutism treatment and independence as a teen or young adult, which is challenging if you don't have selective mutism, but especially challenging for those who do. Self-advocacy in general, what that means, how you understand your goals, what are your strengths and your weaknesses, how to pursue those goals, and then also keeping up motivation in treatment, because as many of you know, this work is really, really difficult, and it can be hard to stay motivated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my story. I don't think this talk would mean as much if I didn't tell you a little bit about where I came from and how I got to where I am today and how I learned all this stuff, because that journey is really all where this information is coming from. So I personally was diagnosed with selective mutism when I was about 5 years old, and I'm currently 26. My anxiety really first became noticeable in preschool, but really only became more pronounced when I started kindergarten. My parents always kind of knew that I was a shy kid. When I was a baby, I would cry when anyone else held me or things like that, but I was relatively friendly to the people I knew well. Preschool was difficult, but it wasn't as significant of a challenge because it was a very small class. There were only about 10 kids. I would do the work. I would speak to one of the teachers, but I wouldn't eat in school. I wouldn't speak to one of the other kids. I would try to wear similar outfits every day. But I participated, and I went there, and we thought that I would just kind of grow out of it. They did end up recommending a doctor, but it didn't really go so well. And we didn't go back, mostly because the doctor and also the other teacher who I didn't speak to in the school thought I was being defiant, and started telling my parents they needed to punish me for doing these things when I was in preschool, because I knew I knew what I was doing and I was doing them kind of on purpose. So we never went back to that doctor who said that. But really, things started to really come to a front when I started kindergarten. So on my first day of kindergarten, I walked into the classroom and stood right underneath the light switch and wouldn't move for the entire day. Of course, this told my parents that they would kind of work with it, and a lot of kids have trouble in their first few days, but this kind of process ended up repeating itself for months on end. I wouldn't speak to anybody. I wouldn't eat, drink, use the bathroom, participate, even sit down. Sorry, just reading Q&A. I wouldn't sit down in front of anyone in school. Sometimes I would even like try to run out of the school building during drop off. That's how anxious and afraid I was of just being in the building. I always wore the same gray sweatpants and tie-dye shirt. And again, a lot of people thought I was doing these things on purpose. I was being defiant. Over the 7 months of when I started kindergarten, I saw a few more doctors diagnose me with generalized anxiety, oppositional defiant disorder, and the therapies that they worked with really didn't fit me, and we didn't really see much progress. And eventually the school actually told my parents that they thought I would never get better, and they really just needed to accept that. But of course, my parents didn't accept that because they knew that the kid that all these doctors and these teachers were seeing and the principal was not the same kid that they saw at home. They never saw the kid who I was at home, who could yell, who could play just fine with people who I was friendly with. Eventually, fortunately, my parents tried to keep pursuing treatment, and I found a doctor in New York City and in NYU who thought he could help. And that's how my parents kind of really first heard about selective mutism and ended up getting diagnosed and started treatment. I talk about this just because back then, of course, even 10 years after that, no one would have imagined me giving a talk to 100 people on Zoom. No one would have imagined me doing these things live in person, which I have done. But I just giving you a perspective of where I started and where I am today. I'm not really gonna talk about my full experiences because I want to get more into self-advocacy and those types of things. I've talked more about my journey in a past webinar if you want to hear more about that. But once I did end up getting diagnosed with selective mutism, I had very extensive behavioral treatment over many years on and off to deal with my selective mutism and social anxiety, mostly a type of exposure therapy where I purposely, my parents, the doctor, and I purposely put me into situations in a very manageable way to put me into situations that made me incredibly anxious to prove to myself that I could do things even though I was anxious about them. And as I said, I'm not going to speak in depth about what into me overcoming my SM, but I'm going to focus specifically in the rest of the talk about how self-advocacy, a desire for independence, really shaped my journey later on. And my goal is that you can take some of these strategies and incorporate them into your own life if you do have SM, or maybe help with a teen or young adult that you know who is struggling. And I want to talk a little bit about how I think about selective mutism and what SM really means to me, because I think this understanding really frames how I approach any type of anxiety that I deal with in my day-to-day life, and how I've spoken about it to other people as well. And I just want to say, like, I'm not a doctor. This understanding might not be the most scientific, but this analogy I think really, really fits my experiences and the experiences of so many other people that I've spoken to. And it makes me a better advocate for myself in the end, because I can speak about selective mutism in a very concrete way that other people can understand. So let's say I told you I was going to call one of you out here in the panel. I can see everybody's name in the panel is this. I'm going to call on you. I'm going to turn on your camera and have you speak to the rest of the group. What kind of physical sensations do you feel about that? I imagine it's not the greatest. You may feel dizzy. You may feel like you're starting to sweat. You may feel stomach ache. You may feel like you're the world is spinning around you. Headaches. Hands might shake. All these are kind of things that I personally experience when I get anxious, whether it's social anxiety, selective mutism, or even bugs or spiders or germs. And these are the kind of very exact sensations that I felt when I was younger, and I had trouble speaking to a stranger in public, or even my teacher at school who I knew for months. And because when I think about selective mutism, I think of it as a fear that I had, just like any of my other personal fears that I have, and just like maybe another one of your fears that you might have. And I really only came to this realization a few years ago when I actually went skydiving. And when I was in the plane at 15,000 feet or whatever, and they opened the door and I was the first one to go, and the kind of instructor who was strapped to my back told me to jump. And of course, you can imagine that experience if you have or even haven't gone skydiving, that it's incredibly fearful. It's incredibly jarring. Makes you feel like you want to get out of that situation immediately. And that's actually the exact same feeling that I get when I interact with people sometimes, still today. Of course, not as much as it was when I was younger. When I was younger, I was with just about everybody. So if you yourself don't have SM, or you're here for someone with SM, think about your personal biggest fear and imagine living it with every day. Imagine it being one of these experiences that is so fearful to you that makes you just want to run away and hide. But think about having that experience just with normal day-to-day situations. Some that might be flying, heights, elevator for some people, snakes, needles, dogs. But the thing about most of these fears, they're actually more kind of like this. And we focused on the big scary thing, but we don't really realize that it's not really a big deal in the end. Of course, this doesn't minimize the fears we have. It just puts them into a different perspective. I know there's nothing to be afraid about when I see a spider on a computer screen, a movie, that it can't touch me. It can't climb out of the screen and crawl on me, but I still get a reaction to it. And a lot of people ask me what I was thinking of or what I was afraid of when I was younger, but I honestly don't really know. But I've come to realize, like, I'm not sure that it matters. As I said, there's nothing running through my head when I see a spider. It's just an immediate response that I want to get away from it. And I think this is why many people with selective mutism, I know it was the case for me, I know it's the case for other people that I've seen, they end up having like a certain look when you interact with them, a certain disposition that's trying to say, you're killing me, get away from me, stop trying to get me to talk. And their willpower is typically stronger than other person's patience that's trying to interact with them. And if I told you, like, let's go tackle your biggest fear today, or like, let's go skydiving tomorrow morning, it won't be a big deal. You would probably look at me like I had 3 heads. And that's the same reaction that I have given to hundreds of people, not thousands, over my lifetime. But the point about this is that all of these fears that I've told you about are things that are manageable, in theory, technically irrational. Maybe not skydiving, that's kind of a rational fear, but a fear of bugs, a fear of going in elevators, a fear of dogs is very much an irrational fear, just like I know selective mutism is an irrational fear that I had. And the point about therapy for me was purposefully doing the things that I was afraid of. And for me, that was controlling the fears that I did have. And for me, self-advocacy is knowing like where I am in my journey and giving me the power to help, to have others help me on that journey, and to help me control my fear and help me push forward and help me do these things that I really personally wanted to do, but just felt like it was impossible for me to do at the time. So when I think about self-advocacy, it helps for me to frame that understanding in what I personally think about, or think about selective mutism and how that has shaped my personal life. And these principles kind of guide everything that I do with challenging my anxiety. So for me, I know anxiety is normal. Everyone has anxiety, everyone has fears, but I know I have anxiety more severe than most people, overwhelming majority of most people. And anxiety and selective mutism is a bully that tries to tell us we can't do the things we want to do. Even things we don't want to do, it still tells us we can't do them. Things that we're supposed to be able to do that other people can do just fine. Anxiety tells us we can't do those things. And selective mutism is driven by a fear that I have. Why I have it, I don't know, but it's a fear. And most of those extreme fears that really stop people from living their lives are really irrational. And then for me, this is the most important one, is the practice piece, because from my experience, I know that doing what I'm afraid of makes it less painful the next time to actually do whatever that exact thing was. And then also, it's really a marathon. This is a very long journey that for me personally took years, and for others also takes years. It's really a marathon. It's not a sprint. I cannot accomplish all my goals in one day, potentially not even a year, potentially not even like if you're in middle school, throughout middle school, you may not be able to fully accomplish all of those goals, but it's a process and always moving towards the next goal that you do have. And then also, it really requires, having anxiety really requires being intentional about the challenges that you face, and then understanding and anticipating them so you can plan ahead. Because if you just put yourself in random situations that are not necessarily situations that you're ready for, it can lead to setbacks. It can lead to feeling like really like you can't do things because it just puts you in a place that's not necessarily a good one. Yeah, and as I said, I really think this is the most important piece, and I think it really is what self-advocacy is about: is helping others practice, helping others help you practice on your journey and getting to where you want to be, whether that's with your parents, teachers, coworkers, a boss at work, whatever it may be. So this is kind of like what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk, is about this practice and how you can make that happen. And I want to acknowledge that this is really all excruciatingly hard work. I liked this cartoon. I saw it in a different SMA presentation, but I think it really fits most people's experiences when they think about, I don't know, personal growth of any kind, anything that they want to do. Of course, this person's trying to play the violin, but whether that's violin, soccer, getting a new job, being able to speak to someone, going to eat at a restaurant, if you have OCD, being able to take 1 shower per day instead of 3, or whatever that may be. People don't want to, or people don't feel good about putting in the work. It's not a compelling task, I'd say. So I just really want to acknowledge that. And the prospect of having to push yourself to do the things that you're afraid of, I agree, is not compelling. And I think if you're an individual, you know that right off the bat. With selective mutism, you know that. If you're a parent or a doctor, I think it helps to frame everything that you're asking someone to do in this perspective, because it helps you to understand why there's pushback, why there may be temper tantrums, why there may be threats, because the feelings are so severe that you'll do anything to get out of that situation if you're really, really afraid of it. And if you are someone with selective mutism, it requires us to purposefully do things that are painful and purposefully seek out those opportunities, because you can't just skip ahead to the part where you're awesome, even though you may want to every day. You have to put in the work to make it to the other side. Just like if you want to play the violin and you want to play on stage, or if you want to join the soccer team and be good at it, if you want to be a scientist and work in a lab one day, you need to study. You need to practice to get there. And for me, it's the exact same thing that I've done to deal with my anxiety. Is I know I need to practice to get to a place that I want to be. And some people are naturally more athletic, and that doesn't mean that you necessarily can't end up joining the soccer team. Some people are naturally more social. I'm sure if you don't have anxiety, you know someone who's more social than you, or is just like a really, really good conversationalist, or can just light up a room full of people. I'm on the complete opposite end of that spectrum. And but it doesn't mean I can't give talks like this. It doesn't mean that I can't go out to dinner with people just because I may be coming from a place that is a little bit further behind than the average person. And I think it's important to think about the desire for independence, especially for teens and young adults who are going through selective mutism, because everything about being a teenager and becoming an adult is about being independent. But if you're struggling with selective mutism, if you're struggling with social anxiety, you can't be independent, unfortunately. And especially if you had anxiety therapy pursued by family at a younger age, many of those decisions about like, what was the goal we were going to work on today? While it may have been somewhat collaborative, it wasn't necessarily really decided by you. Ideally, it was a little bit collaborative, but still, again, my parents, when I was 6, I had no desire to speak to my teacher, I don't think, but that was the goal that we decided on and we worked on it. But if you're 15 and you're in high school, or you're 21 and working somewhere, your parents are not there with you. It's not as okay for your parents to speak to your manager at work about the challenges that you're struggling with. I'm sure some people are okay with that, but it's not the same as speaking to a third grader's teacher. So it requires a lot more independence. It requires a lot more work on us as individuals to kind of pursue these goals, understand what we're working towards, and like actually plan on doing them on a day-to-day basis. And part of continuing to work on this anxiety, these choices are, again, personal responsibility as much or as little as we want them to be, fortunately. And that's definitely a double-edged sword, because it gives you more of a say, but it also means that it's up to you to necessarily take on these tasks. And it's much easier for a 21-year-old to resist going to college than it is for a 6-year-old to resist going to school. My parents could have picked me up, put me in the car, and drove me there, and the principal took my hand and walked me to my classroom. Of course, that cannot be done in college or at work. So I'm going to talk a little bit. Actually, I see there are some questions. Let me go to those, and then I will come back to you. I got one question about, does it make a difference if you're talking in person or through a video conference? For me personally, I don't mind. Maybe if I started doing these talks on video and then going to in person, it would have been more difficult for me. But I actually started doing these talks in person and then transitioned to doing ones like this in video. So I actually personally haven't had much of a difference, but I definitely could see it being different for many people. It's a question about how you gain self-esteem. I think it's a very nuanced question. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and motivation later on. So hopefully I'll get to that. And someone asked about the recording. Yes, we have a recording of this, and it will go up on YouTube in a few days. Okay, back to the slides. So really, what is self-advocacy? For me, I think it has many different definitions for different people, and it's really like a catch-all term. But the way I've kind of framed it in this presentation is how you can, as an individual with selective mutism, advocate for yourself to work on your goals, but also how you can have other people help you with approaching your goals and getting to a place where you want to be. Because just because you may have a goal to give a presentation, if you're in college, give a presentation, doesn't necessarily mean you get up and you just do it, because that in and of itself is incredibly difficult if you've never done something like that before. So for me, self-advocacy is how can you communicate with the professor in advance about the challenge that you may have, or ask for them if you could practice. Or self-advocacy could mean going to my college had a speech center, so you could go to the speech center and practice with someone there. That in and of itself is self-advocacy, because you're personally doing something that you wouldn't necessarily have had to make something more manageable kind of in the end. And that's kind of how I've framed this kind of going forward. And there are 4 main steps that I've highlighted here. One, I think it's really important to kind of decide on your goals and what you're working for. As I said, if you're a teen or young adult, a lot of this is up on you about what do you want to do in life? Where do you want to be? And I think it's important to think about it in the sense of, if SM were not holding you back, what is it that you would really want to do? It can be hard to kind of think about if you've kind of been on an anxiety journey for 10 years and you may have not made much progress because you haven't got the right help or it just hasn't been accessible. Thinking about like how your life could be different is just like, I don't know, it's like a fairy coming down and saying, how much magic do you want today? It's not necessarily an easy thing, even though it may just appear on the surface for those of you who are not living like this, but maybe know someone. Two, I think it's really important to know your strengths and weaknesses. What types of tasks are more and less difficult than others? Even if you haven't left the house in a year, I would guarantee if I said, would it be easier to go to a convenience store or go to the mall, you'd probably have a different answer for each of those. You'd probably be able to tell me. So I think no matter where you are in your journey, know what you find easier, what's more manageable, what's significantly less manageable, and where has that success been in the past. 3 is understanding your needs and what support others could potentially provide you to accomplish those goals, whether it's a doctor, parents, therapist, friend, sibling. When I was younger, my brother was really important to my experience of getting over my anxiety, and because he was there to be able to help me with a lot of things when I was younger. 4, and then how do you actually pursue those goals that you've kind of decided on? How do you prepare for taking those on, and how do you keep track of that progress? So I'm gonna go through each of the 4. So in understanding what your goals are, as I said, I recognize this could potentially be a very difficult question than it seems on the surface. And if your goals really aren't specific, it can feel very hard to actually achieve them. If you just think about like, I want to get over anxiety, it's how do you know if you've gotten over anxiety? If you ask me that question today, I'm not sure that I would say I have, because it impacts me in so many different areas of my life still, but I'm not, of course, not in the same place I was when I was 5. So I think it's really important to be very specific about your goals and where you want to be. So 1 is focusing, I think, on your wants. And I think it's important to not get held up thinking about your current situation. If you're a young adult with SM and you're still struggling quite a bit, I think it's important to not get held up thinking about your current limitations, because that's not really where you want to be. You want to move past that. And understanding your goals will understand really what you're shooting at, what you're aiming for. And I think it could be really, really helpful to actually just like brainstorm and make lists of goals in each area of your life, whether that's work, relationships, socially, with your family, school. Understand like, what do you personally find interesting? What do you personally find that you want to improve upon? And then 3, identifies where your current place is different from those goals that you're aiming for. And you can kind of see where you could potentially fill in the gap to get there. And as I said, it's also, again, really, really important to be very specific about these types of things, because if you're very concrete about the goals, it will help you find ways to actually accomplish them. Easy example I made before is saying you want to get over your anxiety. How do you accomplish that? It's not a reasonable place to start with. But if your goal is to give a presentation in school, in college, or in high school, there are definitely intermediate steps that you can identify to get to that place. That's actually pretty easy to identify, whether that's answering a question in class in front of people, presenting to just the teacher, presenting to a group of 4 people, going to the speech center to present to somebody else, asking if you could go into the classroom while nobody's there to be able to present to no one. And those are steps that you can use to get to that eventual goal. So there's this acronym called SMART. I didn't make this up, but many people have used this in the past. So really your goals, no matter what they are, should be kind of very specific and actionable. So not be more social, but potentially have 2 close friends. M is measurable, not feel less anxious, but do 3 things this week that made me anxious. If my goal is to feel less anxious this week, I don't know if I succeeded in that, but if my goal is to do 3 things that made me anxious, I would know if I succeeded in that. And then they should also be achievable by understanding like where you are currently and what your current place is. If you have never spoken in class before, it would probably not be an achievable goal for next week to do a presentation. So understand where, what seems achievable in the right time frame. And then your goals, I think, especially as you're independent and as you get older, they should be relevant to what is important to you, because with that motivation, if your goals are not important to you, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to pursue them, especially if they're decided by others. And they should also be kind of time bound, so you have some own kind of accountability and pressure on yourself to actually achieve them. Because if I say want to give a presentation in school at some point, if you're in high school, it could mean potentially 4, could mean 8 years from now. So you want to set like deadlines for yourself, I think, if you really want to get to a good place. So the second part, I think that's really important to being able to advocate for yourself, is knowing where your strengths and weaknesses really lie. If you think about your strengths, I think it's a great place to start is looking at all the difficulties you have, looking at your list of goals, and what areas do you personally feel strongest in? What areas have you had success with in the past? What areas have you not as much? And then I think it's much easier to start where you feel strong, to build up that self-esteem, to build up that self-efficacy, and knowing that you actually can do things that make you anxious, even though they feel really bad. And if you start where you feel strongest, that can help kickstart that motivation, rather than starting in a place where you feel not as good about. It can be really, really difficult to make progress there. But once you start building kind of on your strengths, you can pick up on those weaknesses as time goes on. But I think it's also quite important to think about where those weaknesses do lie, because if you're not really aware, of course, you'd probably be aware, but at least cognizant, really like knowing in your head, like the top 3 places that you're going to have real complications with, and you try to like go into those situations, you're not going to get into a good place, probably. So for me personally, this is something I've done. I like to think in thinking about my weaknesses, I like to think about like, what do I see as being literally impossible for me to ever do? And of course, that doesn't mean it is literally impossible. It just means it will be a lot of work to get there. Because I personally know over the past 20 years, I probably said X is literally impossible to ever accomplish, literally hundreds, if not thousands of times. But it helps to frame like my personal feelings about a particular scenario or situation that makes me incredibly fearful. And then the third part of self-advocacy, I think that's really important, is to understand what are the things that you really need to be successful and how you can accomplish those goals. So for each of the goals, you can think about where do you actually need to work on them, because they're all can be very, very different. Some of them may be school, some may be work, social events, with family, with a friend, in a relationship. And those approaching them could look very, very differently. For school, it might not be as easy to practice things. It may require that you actually like write an email to the teacher and ask if you could come into the classroom before class starts, or potentially writing an email to the principal and saying, hey, can I, would it be okay if I come in at 7:30 before the bell rings and go to the classroom and present to nobody? For me, that's like a really, really great example of self-advocacy, where you're asking for something that isn't necessarily infringing on anybody, but you personally you're getting practice with something to help you be successful in the future when it kind of matters. And then for each of those situations that you've kind of identified, understand who can support you. And support doesn't necessarily mean like direct support, like that example I mentioned about principal letting you into the school early in the morning, technically that person is supporting you in that situation, but also could be more in depth. Like a therapist can be very supportive in helping you frame your goals and helping you be accountable, or a friend can be supportive in like going to the mall with you at a busy time, because you yourself know that if you went with your parents, you would feel like really, really anxious about it, even though it's one of those things that feels impossible, but going with a friend may feel more manageable. And then also, like, what is your specific ask of them when you identify the where you need to approach it and the who? So the where for the thing about the presentation is the school building. Who's the principal? What is your specific ask of them? Can I come in next Monday early, or not even next Monday, sometime next week before my presentation to practice? And then when will they help support you? So all these things are really important to understand your approach to self-advocacy and what are the things you actually need to work on your goals. Then, of course, none of this means anything if you're not actually pursuing them. You can identify all your strengths and weaknesses in your goals and where you want to be in life, but if you're not actually working towards them, which is the hardest part, you're not really going to get anywhere. So for me, what I've done in my life that doctors and therapists have helped me with, and my parents, is start with a hierarchy. And some people they like to start at the bottom. Some people like to start at the top. Some people like to start at the top and the bottom and then work their way through. Again, like I mentioned, for me, sometimes it's really helpful for me to understand like where my place is, to again, think about what I feel like is never going to happen, and put that at the very top. And then at the bottom, put something that feels kind of somewhat doable, but is difficult. Shouldn't necessarily have something here that if I told you, okay, let's go do this now, you'll feel just fine about it. That isn't necessarily something that you're struggling with. So the thing that's on the bottom of your hierarchy should feel doable, but difficult. And again, you start, when you actually start pursuing these goals, you start at the bottom and work your way up, because again, if you want to run a marathon, you want to present in front of the school, you don't start running 26 miles the first day. You don't start presenting to an auditorium full of 800 people the first day of training, the first day of practicing. You start with something that's more manageable, that's easier to approach, that will help you build self-esteem, that will help you build motivation. And everything on the hierarchy should feel challenging, and their aspirations to work towards. And yeah, so I found this to be incredibly helpful when I do have my list of goals, putting them in an order like this will help me kind of identify what order I want to approach them in, and then also both the order of how I want to approach them in, but also the order of how difficult they are and how they feel to me. So self-advocacy in general, I know, can be very, very difficult. Like I mentioned, just like emailing the principal to ask if you can use the school building before class might feel potentially very awkward, even if you're not someone with anxiety. So it can be very uncomfortable to ask for help, because in that sense of asking for help, you're admitting a weakness that you have, which everybody, they have anxiety or not, find very difficult. But self-advocacy requires that you kind of put that feeling aside, because you're working on getting to a place down the line. It requires you to be kind of very forward about your needs and what you're looking for. So at some point, and for some people, it may benefit you to disclose your anxiety to others that you're working with, or someone that you're asking to help. I think that's a very personal choice and can depend upon the situation. Of course, if you're in middle school or you're in high school and you have selective mutism, it's very likely your teachers already know. But I never personally necessarily told them that I have this. It was always document was sent to them at the beginning of the year, or if I had an issue with something, oftentimes it was my parents who reached out to help. Of course, later on, like when I went to college, it was always me that did that. But in those times, I have to, principal person who runs the school is not just going to let anybody come into the building early to do a practice presentation. You need to have a reason why, probably. So in some situations, it may benefit to disclose that anxiety. And that could be very different, whether it's school where you do have like legal protections for you, and the workplace where technically you do as well, but it can be more complicated, more nuanced. And just like you may practice your exposures for speaking to people, practicing asking for help, even if it's non-verbally, it could also be really important. So like even little things, like I have a really unique example, which for those of you here who have anxiety may identify with. So I went to Dunkin' Donuts yesterday, like I do most mornings, and the person knows my order. So they handed me a corn muffin, but I didn't necessarily want a corn muffin that day. I wanted a chocolate chip muffin. But me actually saying to the person, hey, I don't want that today, was very, very difficult. And actually I didn't yesterday. And that is something that I noticed and recognized, that I let my anxiety interfere with my life. I know that's a very tiny example, and some of you are probably laughing at this example. I do a little bit as well, but it's a real example and something that I can identify, where I didn't practice self-advocacy in that situation where I should have, because I was letting that anxiety interfere with what I actually wanted, even though it was kind of a small thing that didn't really matter in the course of my day-to-day. And I have it here to talk to you about. And then also sometimes it can be really important to be assertive. Like in that situation I talked about yesterday, I should have been assertive and advocating for what I actually wanted. Because if you don't necessarily ask for something, the answer doesn't necessarily have to be no. But if you don't ask, it is no. If you don't ask the principal if you can come into practice early, you're not going to get the opportunity. But he may, or she may say no, but you have to be able to ask. You have to be able to be assertive and advocate for the potential that it may work out and you be able to get to a place that's better for you. And then also, I think it's really important to kind of set boundaries with the people that you are asking to help you with, or even people you're not necessarily asking to help you with, but are potentially pushing you in ways that you don't feel comfortable. Self-advocacy in and of itself could be setting boundaries with people, whether it's a friend who's trying to get you to go to a club or go to a bar and you don't feel comfortable about that, and it's not a place that you find that it will be manageable today. It requires you to set boundaries and say, hey, I cannot do this today, or I cannot do this week. I really would like to do this with you, but it's not something that I can do. That in and of itself is advocating, being able to say, no, I'm not ready for this. That doesn't mean you'll never be ready for it. It just means you're not ready for it today. And having that setback may actually put you in a worse position than you would have otherwise. So here I just have a list of lots of examples. So asking a friend to give you more time to respond to them when you talk, asking your friend to be more patient with you, asking teacher, professor, coworker, manager if you could practice whatever it is with them, asking teacher, professor if they can look over your project before you present to the whole class, asking a friend or a coworker to go to a happy hour party that you have with you, asking your parents if you can go to the restaurant that you're planning on going to early so you can pick the seat that you want, or just being able to be in the place before everybody else gets there. But in all this, I think it's really important to remember that self-advocacy is not, the point of self-advocacy is not to be used to get out of a situation altogether. It's not supposed to be used to just make anxiety, put you in situations that don't make you anxious. The point is that these are accommodations to really make a challenge doable today. It's something that you're going to approach when you're ready. I think that's really important to keep in mind when you kind of go through this experience. So I'm almost done. So please, as I finish here, put some questions in the Q&A box so I can get to them when I'm done. I have about 2 or 3 slides left. So as I mentioned at the top of the talk, that I think motivation in all of this is so important that a lot of times people kind of forget about or don't put as much emphasis on in pursuing treatment, because they're so focused on the goals and so focused on where you want to be, that I think it's important to kind of think about what is that motivates you and how you can kind of continue on that journey. And for me personally, this comes with an understanding in the beginning that you're going to have setbacks, that you're not necessarily just going to get to the place that you want to be on day one. You're going to build a hierarchy, come up with some goals. You may not complete all of them. Even after 20 years, you may not complete all of them. And figure out your plan B ahead of time can be a really, really important strategy to make you feel motivated about continuing to work on things. So whether it's if you have really a lot of difficulty ordering at restaurants and that's your goal for today, but understanding that your plan B is to tell your friend who's sitting next to you what you want to order, and they're going to tell the waiter or waitress. Understanding where those forks in the road that you can really take to your advantage. And then I also think it's important to be understanding with yourself and be able to do self-care. What is it that you can do to remain calm and keep your goals in mind? And when I was younger, a lot of that had to do with rewards. So my parents used to give me things to reward me. I used to get toys for my hamster as a reward for doing things that were scary. But later on, I know one of the things that I did a couple of years ago, right after college, and I was still going to therapy, is that after therapy, I went to McDonald's every single day. And that was, for me, I knew that even if I didn't really want to go to therapy today, I knew that afterwards I was going to go to McDonald's, which was next door. And that in itself was rewarding for the hard work of going there and working on myself. I know this was a lot of info. I really want to go back to this slide because all this can seem very, very daunting. And I'm talking to you from a place where I've actually worked on this over the past 20 years, and you may be coming at it from a very different place or a different part in your journey. You may be even older than me and working on challenges that I have already overcome. That doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't worked hard enough, or it just means that you're starting in a different place and you're here today trying to learn more about it and how you can improve. But as much as we want to, we cannot just skip ahead to the part where we're awesome. A lot of this is really, really hard work. And I just want to acknowledge that this is very difficult. And if you take one thing from this presentation today, I want you to remember this and say this to yourself every day. Even if you don't have anxiety about social situations, or if you don't have selective mutism, I'm sure you get anxious about something in your day-to-day life. And I think it's really important to know that anxiety lies to us. I believe that anxiety should be eradicated in all its forms. It's a very tricky thing, and it's not easy, but it's doable as long as we put in the work. So thanks. I'm going to go through some of the questions now. Feel free to add some in the chat. We have about 10 minutes. So thanks, everyone. So kind of go through these. How does SM affect you today? Fortunately, I would say that it really doesn't all that much. It's more that I have social anxiety that kind of really impacts me. I guess it depends on your definition of SM, because most social situations I can speak just freely. But if you think about that example, tiny example I gave you about Dunkin' Donuts yesterday, would someone consider that selective mutism because I couldn't say what I wanted to say? Maybe, but I mostly feel like I have completely overcome my selective mutism. It's really social anxiety that I deal with kind of on a day-to-day basis, whether it's going to restaurants or going to malls, being around large groups of people. Those still are kind of challenging for me. The question is, how old were you when you learned what you were afraid of? Selective mutism a symptom or result of fear? I think that's a complicated question. Honestly, I still don't think I know what I'm afraid of. Even when I go to a mall today or a crowded place and I feel anxious, I do not know what I'm afraid of. I know I have selective mutism. I know I have social anxiety disorder. I know I get anxious in social situations. Maybe that's what you mean by knowing what you're afraid of. But especially if someone's younger, maybe middle school, high school, it's possible they might not know. It's possible they do have an answer. Of course, my situation is not universal. Or many people say that they really identify with being afraid of what other people think of them, being afraid of how other people think of what other people think of their voice. I can't say that I really had many of those thoughts. How did you overcome your anxiety to be able to speak now so publicly? Well, doing all of this, but over the past 20 years. I would say I have another webinar on the Selective Mutism Association YouTube channel that I talk more about my experiences. Of course, I also have this book that I wrote, Learning to Play the Game. Wrote about it. I wrote it quite a few years ago now. It's not the best writing, but it goes through more in depth year by year, kind of what my journey was like and how long some of these things actually took. I'm sitting here telling you today about all these things I did, but it literally took 20 years for me to be able to sit here and say those things, which it's a long time. Question about what role medication has played in your treatment and ability to overcome SM. I did take medication when I started taking medication when I was in elementary school. I actually started in 2nd grade when my social anxiety started to become more problematic. Originally, I was just diagnosed with selective mutism, but later on, I was diagnosed with social anxiety disorder because it started to become even more difficult for me to participate in class. I didn't even want to give my work to the teacher. That's how anxious I was about even social situations like that. So I started taking anti-anxiety medication. I've taken it on and off since then. I've done 4 or 5 different courses. The last time I was on medication was 2018, but I haven't been on since. And for me, it was always like a tool that we had in our toolbox where if things became more difficult or I was in periods of time in my life that were incredibly anxiety provoking, like switching schools, graduating college, moving across the country, which is something I did. I took medication to kind of helped tamp down my anxiety. And for me, the way I explain it is that taking the medication didn't make all of these fears kind of just vanish. It's not something that I took and I became a different person. It made it so I could more easily move up the hierarchy more quickly, I'd say. That's probably the best way to explain it. The way I've talked about it before is that asking me to do something on that hierarchy may have been asking me to climb a 10-foot wall with the right doctor and with the right support from my school and with my parents' support. It's possible I would have gotten over a lot of those things, but for some of those challenges that I was working on, it didn't happen, or it didn't happen at the pace that we were happy with. So the medication helped knock that wall down to 5 feet. It wasn't that the wall was gone. It wasn't that I didn't still have difficulties, but it made challenging myself more doable. And that in and of itself made me feel kind of better about where I was headed. Did you play any team sports? If so, what helped you for games? I did not play any team sports. That was always one of the difficult things that I dealt with. Actually, I played flag football for a year or two, but I'm not sure I ever touched the ball because team sports were incredibly anxiety provoking. They were one of those things that I thought was never ever going to happen. Even though actually when I was younger, I did want to play football. So I did not have a good experience with that, but I think it's very individualized. If someone who's more athletic and has selective mutism, more athletic than they may feel like that is being motivating to them, but for me, it wasn't. Things that were motivating to me actually was joining the Lego club at a town over. I really enjoyed Legos, being able to do that with other people. Not necessarily something that I was excited about, but it was like an extracurricular activity that I could be motivated about. I could more easily challenge myself. As I mentioned countless times in this presentation, this is very hard work, and feeling motivated about what you're working on, I think, is really important, because if I told you that we're going to go put yourself through torture today, being able to do that with something that maybe seems a little bit more enjoyable is probably much more satisfying than doing it with something that you absolutely really have no interest in. And for me, that's often been like team sports, things like that. I personally was never good at sports and those types of things. It wasn't something that excited me. But joining the Lego club actually was something that was exciting. So I put myself through the pain to do that. Another thing that helped a lot is I actually, I worked on the tech crew at my school for musicals and plays. I actually found that to be quite enjoyable. And in some ways, it's kind of like a team sport because you really have to work closely together. So I think it's important in understanding the things that you're working on is not just to do them just for the sake of it, but really like try to help if you're a parent or a teacher or a therapist, to try to help pick goals that are really exciting to the person, because then they'll be more likely to be able to take them on, at least more interested in it. What was the most helpful practice when you were a tween? That is, never talk to a teacher. How do you take that first step? For me, when I think about any type of thing that was anxiety provoking, it was helpful to break it down in like the tiniest of steps that you could even think about. So as an example, when I was in kindergarten and we tried to get me to talk to my teacher, things we would do is like, we went into the school building before anyone was there, just being able to like talk in the room that the teacher is normally in my classroom. That in and of itself is a anxiety provoking step. And then being able to talk to my mom and the doctor in that room, and then the teacher standing by the door, and then the teacher progressively moving closer. So like she could even hear my voice. We actually even like brought a video of me talking to the classroom and showed it to them, things like that. Yeah, I think I talk more about this in my book, and I think on the other webinar. And if you look at some other resources from the Selective Mutism Association about fade-ins, those it's really what I found to be very helpful as I was going through my SM journey, is how do I progressively fade people, places, activities into my kind of zone of comfort in the very tiniest of steps. Sorry, I'm trying to read through all these. Did you have trouble making friends? It was very problematic for me throughout my schooling years. The first like real friends that I probably made wasn't until my senior year of high school, and it was also one of those things that I thought was impossible. And I think it's important to recognize that, especially for people with SM and social anxiety, that can be really challenging. And really important for me was like doing those extracurricular activities where there was like a shared task, a shared thing that we could do together, something that I enjoyed, something, of course, that I knew they enjoyed. Being able to get that practice speaking to people my age in those like those kind of areas that were less high stakes were very helpful for me to feel more comfortable in making friends. We only have about a minute left. I got some questions about finding a job or doing interviews. I think, again, practice has been the most important thing. I remember the first interview that I ever had, and I probably don't think I practiced enough for it. So whether it's practicing with person at school, going to the career center if you're at college and practicing with them, they're usually more than happy to help practice. Finding, probably don't want to practice with your parents, but finding, I don't know, friend of a friend who may works in some area that you're interested in and doing a practice interview with them, writing out what you want to say, specific questions, going online, finding common questions they may ask, depends on the role, and write out your answers ahead of time so you can feel more prepared when the actual time comes. I think that's definitely has helped me a lot in just being able to prepare what I want to say before it actually comes time to say it. Unfortunately, not enough time to go through all the questions, but I see there's one thing about relatives. I think there's more in my book, and on the other webinar that I did, I talked more about my brother. I think there's actually a whole chapter about my brother. I see there's one question about that. But thanks everyone for coming today. The recording for this will be posted in the next day or two on YouTube, and feel free to share with whoever you'd like. And then I just want to plug Selective Mutism Training Institute, SMTI, which is an SMA event, is linked in the chat. And I think it's a really great experience, if you're kind of early in your SM journey as a caregiver, that you can sign up for this and you can learn more in depth over 2 days about selective mutism and how you can help someone, you can help your child with selective mutism. And after the presentation, you actually get like free consultation calls with the people who did the talk, who are all real experts in selective mutism. So I think it's a really great opportunity. Make sure you check that out. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a good night.